Hi, welcome to this week's edition of PHQ, questions from the personality hacker community. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And Addison, let's get right to our question today.
Hi there. Just discovered your podcast a couple of weeks ago and I'm devouring it. Anyway, I'm wondering if the two of you might weigh in on how the descriptions of generations, baby boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, etc., intersect with personality type theory. How might they inform each other, and how might the characteristics of various type preferences manifest in members of a different generation? If you've already addressed this somewhere, no worries. I'm sure I'll find it as I work my way back through your content. Thanks for considering, Tracy Fox.
Thanks, Tracy, for the question. This is actually something, this idea of generations and personality type is something that Antonia and I talk about a lot lately. And it's really interesting. It's an interesting question, interesting thought exercise, interesting perspective. We haven't done any formal testing or research around generations and personality type. We have some anecdotal experience and some thoughts around it because we do see generations show up differently. I think our culture as humans really does impact how we express our personalities. So here's kind of the general. This is the first thing I'll say about this. In general terms, you have to remember that personality type, when we're talking about this, and especially the approach we take here at Personality Hacker, is your personality is how your mind works. It's how your mind learns information and how your mind makes decisions. It's not so much about the behavior that you exhibit into the world. Now, obviously, your behavior is a great tool for us to discover personality types, right? We look at behavior, like when we're doing live profiling sessions with someone, obviously we take behavior into account, the activities they do. But what we're really after is how the mind works. So what's interesting about that is that you could have you could have the same personality type. Let's say you had a greatest generation, let's just say INFJ, you had a baby boomer INFJ, you had a Generation X INFJ, and you had a millennial INFJ. Well, because of the culture, because of the time period, because of technology and the way they grew up, all four of these different INFJs would most likely show up to the world in a very different way. You're going to have a lot different expressions. So the behavior is going to look very different. So if you're looking at behavioral keys or cues, it's going to look different for each of those people. But if you really study how their mind is working, you're going to know, okay, they're all INFJs. They're just showing up very different based on their culture, their generation. So those are some general things to think about in terms of that. We can try to anecdotally at least get a little more specific around some of these.
Yeah. How, basically, the environment in which we're raised culturally creates imprints inside of us that in some ways, unless we're really good at going in and reprogramming our own brains, which is a skill that one can learn but takes a lot of practice and some time, we sort of get permanently imprinted with the culture of how we were raised. I think of the concept of moderns versus postmoderns. I think of the idea of, with modern people who have a modern mind frame, there's this idea that there's one source of information, there's one authority figure, you go to the expert and the expert gives you one piece of information, versus postmoderns, which take a very meta perspective. They want to see what everybody has to say. There's a lot more concepts around crowdsourcing information and then figuring out which one makes sense to you as an individual. Those are radically different approaches to the world. And if you've got the same personality type, like you mentioned, Joel, an INFJ that's a modern versus an INFJ that's a postmodern, the INFJ that's a postmodern might look at the modern INFJ and go, well, you can't be an INFJ because you're not taking enough perspectives, right? You're not perspectiving enough. Well, it's not because the INFJ is not perspectiving. It's not that they're not using introverted intuition or perspectives as their driver process. It's that they were taught to look for one piece of expert opinion or advice, and then that was sort of the control now going forward for all of the other advice around that topic. So I think the way that our generations are encouraged to think, how we're imprinted based on the social structure around us, I think that that's profoundly impactful for, personality type theory and trying to figure out people's types and how they could be different from each other, even if they have the same, say, Myers-Briggs personality type. Yeah,
I actually was just talking about this with you, Antonia, the other day. I know this. I know an INFJ in my life who is a baby boomer who leads with that process of perspectives. And all INFJs I have met and talked to have a great ability to basically understand how other people think to the degree that they can get into their heads. This seems to be at least a talent. Maybe it's not always a developed skill, but at least a talent. So I was confused the other day because this is such a talent of INFJs often that when this person was doing a Google search, they were having a struggle perspectiving to think about how someone would search for the information they were looking for. So oftentimes when I'm doing a Google search, how to install a piece of software on my computer, I'll usually try to think, how do other people search for this online? And that's how I'll search for it as well. Because if I can perspective shift, and I'm not an INFJ, but if I can perspective shift enough to understand how someone else is searching for something, then I usually can find my answer because there's a lot of information written for SEO reasons and for searches to pop up in that way. But this person was trying to search for information. They were having a big struggle doing this. And I remember telling you, Antonia, I'm like, this is baffling to me. I would think an INFJ would be able to perspective shift. And we were talking more about it. And it's just because of their age and their generation, they didn't grow up using the internet. They didn't grow up understanding how Google works. And they may not even understand a full sense of how the internet's pulling information. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, this person's very insightful when they shift perspectives in real time. It just happens to be on the internet. They're showing up in a different way. And then I think of my younger, my peers that are INFJs, or even people younger than me that are INFJs that are masterful at search and thinking about how the internet functions. So, I mean, that's just an example, a story example of how this might show up, the same personality type functionally in the real world.
Yeah, I can think of another example. Let's take, for example, INFPs. INFPs lead with introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity, which is very much a conviction function, right? And by conviction function, I don't mean like it's only ever creating convictions. However, I've noticed that INFPs do the best when they have a strong feeling around something that propels them into action. Well, again, let's take, for example, moderns versus postmoderns. There was a time period where you were basically handed your convictions to some extent, or maybe you found your own convictions. But it wasn't like, it didn't feel like it was so open frame. It was like, we know there is one right way of doing something. So I'm just going to I just got to keep finding that right way. And then once I find it, then I'll lock into it and now I'll be propelled into action. Versus this postmodern world where the concept of one right way is a lot more open frame. It's a lot more sort of, arbitrary. This concept of, definitive right and wrong and definitive morality. It's getting more and more sort of, well, how do you feel about it? And so for an INFP in the postmodern world, it might feel like there's not a lot of, there's no peg to hang their conviction on or their passions on. So it might be actually more of a struggle for an INFP in the postmodern world than an INFP in the modern world. And so that's another component to generations, how generations impact type, is that certain personality types might have more of a struggle depending upon which way the current culture is sort of blowing, right? Like there have been time periods in the past probably where certain personality types just absolutely thrived in those conditions because the generation or the time period in history was very conducive to their type. And then there's other time periods where, they were, I use this metaphorically, but possibly literally burned at the stake because of who they were and how they showed up and how it was not deemed acceptable at the time. So I think time periods are very influential in personality type. And there could just be some time periods in history, including the current generation, or sort of how we've got like 3 generations butting heads right now politically and, professionally, etc. And how during that sort of butting heads between the boomers and the Gen Xers and the millennials, and how the power structures are all going to look, and the radically different ways that they're all going to come at reality. And then you've got type in there, and you've got, one personality type that would have done terrible as a baby boomer, but does fantastic as a millennial, but then the boomers are still in power. And so how does that work? So I think all of that is very influential. I actually think that this would make a fantastic regular podcast. Now that we're talking, I'm thinking that we should make this into a regular podcast. I
think we should definitely explore this topic a little bit more in the future, and I think that I have an idea for that too. So let's tag that, because I think I've got a surprise that we could bring on that podcast potentially. Someone I want to reach out to that has some thought around some of this too. So I think, Tracy, the question is a really good question, and hopefully we gave you some things to think about in this PHQ. And I think it's such a great question that we'd like to do some more discussion around it and expand upon it and really dig into, some of these concepts, some of these ideas in a broader concept, in a broader conversation. So I think it definitely impacts type as far as generational lines. I think it's definitely something that will show up differently for different types. So just one last kind of thought around this, and then again we can do a bigger deep dive in a main podcast. But oftentimes perceivers show up to the world because perceivers organize internally. Their mind is very organized. As a perceiver, if your mind is very organized, that means your outer world can be more free form. And oftentimes that shows up behaviorally, like clutter in the outside world, or maybe you're not as organized. Your desk might be a little bit more messy. And we see judgers organizing their outer world so they can have inner world freedom. So, a time period of the 1950s, let's just say, a baby boomer growing up in the 1950s, let's say they were a perceiver, but they grew up in this time period of everything kind of command and control. You were talking about, Antonia, where it's, marketing messages are the same marketing messages. Most people in the 1950s were all watching the same TV programs they could talk about the next day. They only had like 3 or 4 channels available. So most people were watching the same television programs. Everybody was kind of on the same page during that time period. It seemed like a very outwardly organized time period. It seemed like a very judger-like time period of our history. And growing up in that time period, if you were a perceiver, you probably have more judger-like tendencies because your culture required that of you. And fast forward to today, we're more of a free-form culture. We're more individually expressive today. We're much more of a perceiver. I would argue a more perceiver-type culture today. I mean, these are general terms, but you get what I'm saying. And if you're a judger growing up now, you probably have more perceiver-type tendencies in your behavior because that's your culture around you. So these are some things I think that come up. These are some ways I think they manifest. And just to kind of conclude with that, some thoughts to take away. I think all of that matters, and I think all of it is impactful on our personality types.
Yeah, good point.
So if you have a PHQ question, by the way, Tracy, thank you so much for the question. Excellent question. If you've got a question for PHQ, questions from the Personality Hacker community, come over to personalityhacker.com and you can ask your question over there. Also, please come over and join our facebook.com/personalityhacker page. We'd love for you to like that page, be a part of the community discussion. We post a lot of content there and a lot of information. A lot of really cool stuff is coming out over there. So please come join us on that community. We want you to be a part of that as well. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we will talk to you on the next PHQ questions from the Personality Hacker community.